The task of this talk today is to trace the historical roots of our 21st century problems by looking at some seminal figures and issues and developments of the 19th and 20th century. But first, to set the context for the 19th century descent into darkness, we need to look at three preceding events that shattered Europe and America and shattered the Western world. The descent into darkness follows these three great breakages. The first, the Reformation; the second, the Enlightenment; the third, the French Revolution. The Reformation was a perfect storm of honest, sincere, religious questioning by people of faith, many of whom were willing to, and some of whom actually did, give up their lives for the expression of their faith. But it was a perfect storm of this religious questioning combined with the rise of opportunistic nationalism. The Reformation, when it hit, it broke the religious, political, and social unity of the West. Warfare was almost immediate and pretty devastating, most everywhere in Europe. So by the end of the 30 Years' War in 1648, 1/3 of the Germans had perished in the war, and similar destruction around Europe. My point about the Reformation is not to lay blame. It's not that the Catholics were wrong or the Protestants were wrong. My point is that the unthinkable had happened. The unbreakable was broken. This first great breakage was an intramural argument about faith from among people of faith, but it led to the second great breakage, the Enlightenment, where very few of the leaders expressed faith. The Enlightenment called itself the Age of Reason, also in consequence called itself the Age of Criticism. Favorite targets of criticism: Church, Bible, God, Jesus Christ. So when we say think critically, it would be helpful for you to know the source of this in this age of criticism. This second great breakage led to the third, which is the French Revolution. It is impossible to overestimate the effects of this event in European history. This was the great benchmark. This was the great breakage. And the French Revolution began and was carried out as an attempt to implement Enlightenment ideals. It began with a kind of a euphoria. They were just almost drunken with the joy of the humanism that they thought they were about to achieve. They talked about a new age. This was a new age for humankind. But this euphoria, this extreme joy all over Europe. I mean, Kant was running down to the mailbox to check his mail to get the news of the French Revolution every day. It had that kind of effect throughout Europe. But very soon, it turned from joy to what's called the terror. And the guillotine became the operative mechanism of force for the leaders of the French Revolution. Thousands upon thousands of French citizens were killed. Tens of thousands of priests and bishops were slaughtered or escaped into exile. And during one particularly vicious episode in what's called La Vendée, a region of France that resisted the revolution for religious purposes, the Revolutionary Army came in and slaughtered 250,000 of the Vendéens. So what began in joy ended in sorrow, terror, and France and much of Europe was in shambles. Now these three great breakages scorched the religious, social, and political landscape. And they made possible our topic for today, which is the 19th century descent into darkness. We're going to do this in 4 parts: Romanticism, Atheism, Nihilism, and Marxism. And the first of these features, Romanticism, first I need to clarify for you that this was not some sort of thing where people were in love and had great feelings about each other. That's not the movement. This movement was about what you see there, the empowerment of the ego. Now, it was only for those who were powerful enough to do it. Everybody couldn't do it. But for those truly powerful, truly stellar, unleashing the ego, magnifying the ego was its first principle. The Romantics explored the dark side of creation. It wasn't just that they became atheists, it's just that they started to notice the suffering, the pain, and death, and they got very interested and fascinated with it. And finally, most importantly, it was about the refusal of all limits. It was a breakage, a breaking out of any externally imposed form. William Blake, one of the greatest of English poets and illustrators, wrote an immensely popular poem called The Tiger, and it was about a physical tiger. But Blake encapsulated the hypnotic attraction of the dangerous and the deadly. And he asked in this poem very edgy questions about the goodness of the God, the Creator, and the goodness of creation. And so as it says there in this couplet, did he smile his work to see? Did he who make the lamb make thee? So the question here is, tigers eat lambs, and there's something explicitly religious in the choice of lamb, the Lamb of God, who takes away the sins of the world. Well, there's also the tigers. Are there also the tigers of God who take away the lambs of the world? The tiger is beautiful, symmetrical, fascinating, but also menacing. And the Romantics were absolutely fascinated with this creature that lives by strength. It does not pity its victims. Its victims are its food. The tiger is from the dark side of creation. So tired of the Enlightenment rationality, the dryness, the desiccation of it. The Romantics led with feeling. Feeling was central for them. So in France, Jean-Jacques Rousseau said, provided you feel that I'm right, I will not bother to prove it to you. Music, you have in the Enlightenment, you have the classical period of people like Franz Joseph Haydn, very careful, very classical construction within certain limits. And then this gives way to Ludwig von Beethoven, who's it's not careful artistry, it's outburst artistry, where he breaks out of the limits. And in many ways, Beethoven's music exemplifies the hero, the romantic hero breaking out of externally imposed forms. Two figures that were remarkably influential in literature, Lord Byron in England and Johann Wolfgang von Goethe in Germany. Both of them used demonic power for their romantic hero to elevate its ego expression. It might seem innocent, but its effects have been wide-ranging. Now, to achieve superhuman intensity of feeling, the romantic hero has to be willing to break all social and moral and religious limitations. And if he really wants to go to the top, he has to accept demonic assistance. Goethe's Faust depicts just such a hero who trades his soul for the promise that his feelings and his actions, there will be no limits whatsoever on them. So the devil figure in Faust, Mephistopheles, promises Faust, to you no goal is set nor measure. Exceeding limits, that's the principle. Well, no limits, okay? But Faust then seduces the beautiful maiden and pure of heart maiden Gretchen. We first meet her when she's coming from communion, or from confession, where she has virtually nothing to confess. And so Faust seduces her, and he promises her she will be part of this with no limits. There will be no end to their rapture. So he says to her, he takes her by the hands and he says to her, let this hand pressure say to you what is unspeakable, to give oneself up wholly and to feel a rapture that must be eternal. Now, note the use of feeling and note the use of eternity. These guys love to use Christian vocabulary, they just don't love Christianity. Faust pulls Gretchen into his diabolically empowered feelings and experiences, and then he impregnates her and he abandons her. And in a fit of madness, she drowns her newborn child. She is imprisoned for it. Her mother is gone, and her brother is dead because Faust has killed him in a duel. She's in prison, utterly mad, utterly miserable, something other than eternal rapture. And she's sentenced to die at first light. Now, the romantic hero, in order to be plausible, does not set out to harm others, but he must be willing to do so, especially for his sexual expressions. Harming others is just collateral damage. The main thing is the ego must be expressed. So romantic heroes want something superhuman. And if it happens to be diabolical, well, it deals with you. They want superhuman energy for themselves, for the expression of their ego in this world alone. They're not the sort who marry, who have children, and over decades of time make steady contributions to a community. Instead, the larger-than-life hero, because he is larger than life, can't live very long. A short life is always what happens as passion burns up the hero and whoever is in his orbit of activity. When John Paul II talked about a culture of death, I think this culture of death had its roots in these romantic heroes. But all is not horrible in the 19th century. There are some wonderful things. One of them was Jane Austen. And in an age where there was so much evil, the good and Christian faith continued apace. Austen's Pride and Prejudice was published in 1814, right between volume 1 and 2 of Faust, of Goethe's Faust. Now, Austen's heroines and heroes are a direct spiritual contrast to Faust and Lord Byron. Her heroes synthesize morality, character development, and romance, real romance. They have romance, there's always romance. But they do it with self-control. They do it within social, moral, spiritual limits. The limiting of the self is the strength of Austen's characters, as opposed to the excesses of the self. So, Austen affirmed what the romantic elevation of the ego denied, which is the value of limits. Recognizing the value of limits actually is quite liberating. It liberates us to respect, love, and serve others rather than engulf them in the expression of our own ego. However, the myth, the romantic myth of unlimited feeling and passion, and that this is the highest good. It broke many, many boundaries, and it continues to tantalize people even in our day. It changed the way we talk, the way we think, and the way we behave, and it did it by glamorizing evil in rather attractive characters. How many of you recently saw just show of hands, how many of you saw or saw parts of the Emmy Awards? Good. All right, so the Emmy Awards, if you didn't hear, I didn't see it either, but I did go online and look at some of it, and the Emmy Awards were weird, and they were explicitly satanic. The costumes were satanic, the dance was satanic, and it was a kind of a sexualized Satanism in the awards. So, point is, what Goethe and Byron were doing in the 19th century, it's not gone. It's still here. Okay, so by the mid-19th century, so many foundations had been shattered that now a new darkness comes upon us, which is public atheism. And the primary figure for that was the great German thinker Ludwig Feuerbach. Feuerbach knew the Bible, he knew theology, he just didn't believe in God. He said that God was a psychological illusion. Now, this character is so important because he was the spiritual father, that's how they described him, of Karl Marx, Friedrich Engels, and Vladimir Lenin. He said, he's the guy who figured it out. We'll put his theory into practice. Feuerbach said, and I quote, God, as we conceive and think of him, is our ego, our mind, and our essence. So he wanted you to think about God. He wanted you to think God. He thought that human beings only really think when they stretch their minds and think God. He said, but don't make the mistake of thinking that God actually exists. So he's about the scariest atheist type. He said theology is just a form of anthropology. And the atheistic elevation of the ego is the philosophical counterpart of what we saw in literature of the Romantics. Well, this makes possible our third feature, which is nihilism. Nihilism comes from the Latin term nihil, which, as you see there, means nothing. It means literally nothing. So the nihilist says existence has no meaning, it has no value, there is no truth, etc. Now, nihilism becomes an issue in Russia and through Russia throughout Europe through a very famous work of this author Ivan Turgenev in 1862 in this book Fathers and Sons. Turgenev created a fictional character, Blatsadov, who is known to every educated Russian. And Blatsadov was the personification of nihilism. So the novel portrays a chasm between the liberal, progressive, university-educated fathers and the university-educated sons who aren't interested in any of that liberal progress. They're bored with the world. They've seen the world. They don't like the world. And they're just bored. And so the nihilists believe nothing and they care about nothing. Nihilists can have associates, but they can't have friends. Like Feuerbach, who believe that God is an illusion. But they went beyond Feuerbach and said, love in all forms, friendship, romance, etc., is also an illusion. Nihilism negates all meaning, value, and truth. To a nihilist, an individual human person, which is so sacred in Christian thought, is no more important than an individual tree in a large forest. To a nihilist, Christianity is not even a serious option. Now the spiritual landscape has been seriously scorched, and this makes way for our fourth endeavor in darkness, which is Marxism. Marx and Engels, his partner Friedrich Engels, turned from the God they no longer believed in, as they learned from Feuerbach, to a revolutionary atheistic vision for this world alone. Sounding like Feuerbach, Engels declared, nothing exists outside nature and man, and the higher beings are religious fantasies they've created are only the fantastic reflections of our own essence. Also sounding like Feuerbach, Marx wrote, the religion of the workers has no God because it seeks to restore the divinity of man. So the first principle of Marxism is no God, no transcendence, this world alone. So they sought progress apart from God, but they ended up giving us the most unprecedented bloodshed in human history. Now, the Marxists became second to none in murder, especially of their own people. And so you might ask, how did Marxism get started? Well, in 1917, you have the famous revolution where the Marxists take over in Russia. But for many, many decades, way back into the middle of the 19th century, you have cells, revolutionary cells, small groups of 5, 10, 20 people in Russia and Europe and all throughout Europe who are plotting, not in a connected way for the most part, just privately, but they're plotting something big. One of these characters and cells was a fellow named Sergei Nechayev. Now this guy was a pretty deadly fellow. Notice that he wrote what's called a revolutionary catechism. Again and again, these guys take the religious vocabulary and they twist it and they turn it to this world alone. Catechism. And here's some of what he wrote in this catechism. He said, the revolutionary must be tyrannical. All the general sentiments of kinship, love, friendship, gratitude, and even honor must be suppressed and give place to the cold and single-minded passion for revolution. He must have but one thought, one aim, merciless destruction. He must be prepared to destroy everything that stands in the path of the revolution. Now, I don't think you can have a civilized conversation with a man like that. Nechayev actually killed one of the members of his own group, apparently to enforce group discipline. Now, in addition to this kind of thinking, you get the embrace of the demonic, explicitly demonic in politics, with Mikhail Bakunin, another who was technically an anarchist, but who militantly said we can have no God because if we have God, we cannot have human freedom. We must have human freedom, therefore we cannot have God. But he did say, he did applaud Satan. Satan was his hero. Satan was his hero because he was a proto-revolutionary, the first revolutionary. One Russian group called itself by the name Hell. Another revolutionary group called itself the People's Will. It 7 times attempted to assassinate the Tsar. The 7th time succeeded. Now, what happened when Marxists came to power in 1970? Well, the first thing was militant atheism became official policy. So, on your left, you see the Cathedral of Christ the Savior. In 1931, the Marxists tore it down and cannibalized its parts for their other hideous building projects. Here, again, in 1917, when they came to power, there were 50,000 churches in Russia, ballpark. In 1939, there were less than 100. That's an amazing destruction. In 1939, which happens to be the year World War II started, they destroyed 8,000 churches in that year alone. 35,000 people of faith were arrested or killed. Now, Karl Marx famously said that the philosophers have interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it, and change it they did. They were the big time change makers. Now, think with me for just a moment. There's three kinds of change. Change can be good, change can be bad, change can just be kind of neutral. But to assume that a change is good is probably intellectually lazy. All right, let's do a brief interlude out of this darkness. Okay. Now, it's a syllogism, since I knew some of our philosophers would be here today, and I wanted to do a syllogism for them. So the major premise is, if humans are made in the image of God, then it is not possible to completely get rid of the moral sense. Minor premise. We actually are made in the image of God. Conclusion. Therefore, human beings cannot completely get rid of morality. Now, this will play a large part in the rest of what I have to say about Marxism. Now, in Christianity, morality is not primary. Sometimes it feels that way, but it's not. Christianity, morality is rooted in the relationship to God. In the relationship to God, you become a son or daughter of God, made in the image of God. Well, now you have a noble status. Morality comes from needing to live up to that status. Morality is not an independent project, and it does not succeed as an independent project. Just read the Enlightenment history. So, under Marxism, the moral sense did not disappear because it cannot disappear. But it did become hidden and twisted. So, Marxism's morality is deracinated and distorted. Now, why are so many people attracted to Marxism? Because they have been for a long time and they still are. The Hungarian chemist and philosopher Michael Polanyi came up with an answer and an analysis. He called it moral inversion. Now, this will be a little difficult to understand, but next few minutes we'll have it done. Moral inversion essentially puts things inside out. So it puts an alleged scientific objectivity on the outside, and then on the inside, really hidden from the Marxist himself, it has this moral sense that cannot and will not go away. So objectivity on the outside, disconnected and distorted morality on the inside. This is the essence of moral inversion, and I believe that our society has been stricken by moral inversion. Now, moral inversion always involves contradictory couplings. You have to put two things together that don't belong together, like one and two there. So it starts off, as all the Marxists do, that there's no universal truth. There's no truth which is true. And then it goes to the second, but we can have universal social improvement. One and two do not sit well together. So Marxism couples its atheism with its displaced and distorted morality. And that's moral inversion. Now remember, moral sense doesn't go away. Because we're made in the image of God, not even an atheist can get rid of it. So Polanyi rather wittily critiqued Marxism in this one sentence. He said that the public, taught by the sociologist to distrust its traditional morality, is grateful to receive it back from him in a scientifically branded wrapping. Now, always focused on this world alone. Marxists tend to demand immediate, comprehensive, political, educational, and social improvement. This is a recipe for intolerance because dissenters must be punished. In speaking with intolerant, angry people, especially Marxists, persuasion and civilized disagreement are replaced by denunciation and punishment. Dissenters must be reported to authorities, and then they must be canceled. Well, there is a strange relationship between the nihilism we talked about, the nihilism of an individual, where in Romanticism, the ego is everything, nothing else really matters. In Marxism, nothing else matters but the state. Strange relationship there, but both lack what is central in Christianity, the human person. And the human person is the prerequisite for our relationships to God, our relationship to all people. Now Christianity has a solution to this Marxism, historically and in the present day. And the solution is lead with love, don't try to lead with justice. If you lead with justice, if that's your first principle, you're just going to be angry with everybody who doesn't share your sense of justice. It's almost inevitable. But if you lead with love for other people, then there's a high probability that justice will be included in that. Now, final remark about Marxism. Marxism attempts the impossible. It wants to capture the energy, the elevated energy of the God it does not believe in, and pour it into strictly human affairs. But without God, there is no divine energy to capture. It's a little bit like trying to have a baby without a pregnancy. Marxism is essentially a religion, an atheistic, godless, soulless religion, a religion of humanity alone. And because it attempts the impossible, it always fails, but somehow it never seems to learn. Its path steeply slopes toward widespread social animosity, human misery, and actual destruction. All right, so in the next 2 or 3 minutes, let me share with you some concluding reflections. Those who cease to believe in God do not cease believing. They have all kinds of beliefs. According to an old proverb, a sacred space is never empty. Now, like the larger society, the sacred space in your own life depends on what or who you invite into the center. Fyodor Dostoevsky was one of the great 19th century authors, or perhaps one of the greatest authors of all time, and he was a Russian Orthodox Christian. He saw all 4 of these components. He saw the madness of the elevated ego. He saw the public atheism, the nihilism, the Marxism. In fact, he wrote a book called The Demons, in which he portrayed one of these proto-Marxist cells. And Dostoevsky looked at these developments and he said, in one of his notebooks, repudiate Christ and the human mind can arrive at the most astonishing conclusions. Now, all these extreme problems are predictable and avoidable. Humanity, apart from God, always ends up being what one writer called inhuman, humanism. So, the book that I wrote, The Long Battle for the Human Soul, from which this talk is taken, is an attempt to show how we got in the mess we're in so we can better negotiate how to get out of it. Books 2 and 3, which are underway now, are my solutions for how to get out. But I cannot end this talk without briefly laying out my basic solution with some help from J.R.R. Tolkien. Tolkien invented a word. He was giving a lecture, I believe it was in Ireland, And he was trying to think through stories and how stories sometimes unfold. So he came up with this term, eucatastrophe. The EU, is taken from the Greek for good or beautiful, and the catastrophe from a sudden turn. So this invented word of Tolkien's is a wonderful turn, a wondrous turning from apparent defeat and in a horrible situation to an unexpected victory. The Lord of the Rings, with Frodo and Sam, at the very end, the Lord of the Rings is essentially a eucatastrophe. Now, Tolkien experienced the darkness of World War I, World War II. He actually fought in World War I. His son was in World War II. And he lived through the Cold War. But he never lost hope. And here's what he said. The birth of Christ is the eucatastrophe of history. The resurrection is the eucatastrophe of the story of the incarnation. This story begins and ends in joy. There is no tale ever told that men would rather find was true. To reject it leads either to sadness or to wrath. Well, many in our time, having rejected Christ or simply having ignored him, have wandered into sadness, frustration, depression, anxiety, or anger. The failure to see that you are a son or daughter of God, made in the image of God, comes at a great cost. And this failure sets a person up to be a sitting duck for whatever the next political, social, or sexual movement and fad will be. But the failure is not necessary. The greatest conceivable victory and eternal happiness is available to anyone who is simply open to it. So let me remind you of Jesus' words, "Behold, I stand at the door and knock, and if anyone will open, I will come in." The hope that Tolkien had, that St. Thomas Aquinas had, that I have, and that I hope you will have, this hope is still very much available. But the hope comes alive in openness to Christ. Christ was, is, and will be present for us and with us. Yesterday, today, and forever. He is the reason for hope. He is the light that overcomes the darkness.
Thank you very much, Professor Rolnick, for this illuminating and provocative lecture. You've given us plentiful food for thought. Just a quick reminder that you have little note cards in which you can record your questions, and the questions will be collected after the response by Professor Boyle, who we're now asking to say a few words about the book.
Thank you for the invitation to be here. Now, the way this would normally work, Dr. Rolnick talks, Rolnick talks, I talk for 20 minutes. Dr. Rolnick maybe gets 2 minutes to respond. We take some questions, we all go home. Well, I'm not going to do that. I'm not surprising Dr. Rolnick about this item. Dr. Rolnick and I have spoken about what he's written in this wonderful book. As he was writing it, many a lunch and a walk talking about the material in it. Then it came out, I immediately read it. We've talked many other times about it since, most recently, just the other evening. And as we were talking, it struck us, well, let's just continue the conversation and let you eavesdrop. So that's why there's chairs here. That's why I'm not standing up. So, and I'm scribbling on some notes here as Dr. Rolnick is talking. So what I'd like to do, instead of just going out for 20 minutes, there's two things that I'd like to talk about, and maybe put these as observations with maybe a question mark afterwards, such that Dr. Rolnick and I might talk about it. I'll throw it at you. I like Dr. Rolnick's end with the Tolkien, the catastrophe with regard to the incarnation. Those of you who hover around Catholic studies know that the incarnation, the reality that Jesus is both God and man, that's a big deal in Catholic studies because we work on this idea, this premise that the incarnation affects everything. And if that's true, then the world that Dr. Rolnick is trying to articulate, the ideas that he's trying to articulate, one of the things I really appreciate what Dr. Rolnick does is he actually thinks ideas have consequences, which is in fact true. You just watched him articulate a set of ideas with consequences. Well, if those ideas that he's looking at come 1,500 to 2,000 years after the incarnation, well, then, how do we think about those in relation one to another? In Catholic studies, some of this, I think, not all of this. In fact, in Catholic studies, love to read the ancient Greek and Roman pagans. We like to teach them, in part because it's interesting to look at a world before Christ. Gives us a way to think, oh, world without Christ, incarnation. So that we have, I think, in all that Dr. Rolnick was presenting, and he's presented as such, a world that is a reaction to Christianity. And indeed, I think maybe actually not understandable apart from being a reaction to Christianity. Over and over again, Dr. Rolnick speaks about that. But what is it like, maybe he and I could talk about the ways in which what we have here are in a number of ways very precisely denials to things that are peculiarly Christian. For example, Enlightenment, the age of reason. I mean, what's not to like about reason? We're at university. Reason's a good thing. But as Dr. Rolnick talked about it, he said, very telling, the Enlightenment has targets. Since when does reason have targets? And the targets that he articulated were essentially all Christian. This suggests that some things that play here in a world after the incarnation. The power of the demonic is an image of revolt, for example. It's hard to imagine any of my beloved Roman pagans talking about Satan, well, period. Next statement. Talking about Satan as somehow an image of revolt and human excellence and human triumph. I mentioned something has happened here. Something rather dramatic has happened here. So part one, I just didn't talk all the thing. I'm just thinking a bit more about that. We talked about that question. What's it mean that we're in a world after the incarnation? And second, just as an observation, so my own intellectual formation long ago, well, I was taught, I drank in with my mother's meal, that in the history of human civilization and history of human ideas, there's at least three things that were just an unalloyed good. The Reformation, the Enlightenment, and the French Revolution. The three places that Dr. Rolnick started. Unalloyed good. Now, as I continue in my life, study, okay, there's some problems. The reign of terror and the French Revolution, the guillotine. Okay, but one learns to realize, well, it's not as if it's exactly intrinsic to what the French Revolution was doing. It's this kind of odd, extrinsic aberration. And as I continue my studies, as I discovered the Catholic faith, one of the things I've learned, there are no unalloyed goods of human making. There's a simple reality. They're always alloyed with something. And part of the great task of trying to think about human activity and human movements is to try and to see good. Yes, reason's a good thing. But when one looks at it to see in this human effort, what does it have within it that isn't an unalloyed good, that brings within it its own difficulties that are in fact intrinsic to it. Part of what I really appreciate about Dr. Rolnick's work, and he's not alone, part of a much larger movement that's inviting those of us who are trying to think, wow, this is all just good, period. Maybe there's things in here that we need to think about more subtly, ways in which reason is good, but maybe reason in certain targets isn't as good. Celebration of the human ego good at the destruction of the human person, maybe not so good. Then when we look, and put it this way, when we look at the ills of modernity, we simply say, well, yeah, they're just old, previously bad things welling up and we need to play whack-a-mole. Or are the ills of modernity somehow deeply related to those very movements of modernity? Is there something more interesting and complicated happening that's at work here? And how to understand it? And as Dr. Rolnick walked through those four movements of the Enlightenment, of the post-Enlightenment, post-Reformation world, 19th century, what was interesting is he was trying to causality. It's not four movements that just isolated and pop up. They work on each other. There's a causal relation here. It's just we're watching an unfolding in terms of kind of like folding, which it were. And the result is a kind of scorched spiritual landscape to use Dr. Rolnick's. Right, so the way these normally work is I don't babble on for a length. Look, I just did that. I'm sorry. My apologies. I was given a microphone. But perhaps I could ask Dr. Rolnick precisely their thoughts on what it means that everything has been charted using a post-incarnational world. We'll just start there. Take it where you want, Dr. Rolnick.
Well, thank you so much for your comments. I think both of us we could deserve an applause. As we're collecting the cards, and if we could ask the two student helpers to please collect the cards. Just wave your hand if you have a card with your question, and then the student helpers will pick it up. I think I see one student. I'm not yet seeing the other. So as we're collecting the cards, I think we could start the conversation.
Well, the incarnation is indeed the eucharist of our history, and it is indeed, I think, our related problems. I meet people all the time, students, faculty, administrators, people that I know, And some of these people are on spiritual fire in the most beautiful way. And I mean, other people who are, well, they're just not sure what they're doing. They're not sure what their purpose is. So it seems like the options are at least laid out before us. There are multiple options right now. There's what one writer called hyper-pluralism. We're not only pluralistic, it's hyper-pluralistic. We have lots and lots of options. But I think for those of us in the West and in the Christian world, I think that there's one option that's going to win, and all the other alternatives may help in some way. But I think Christ needs to be at the center. I don't think there's any way out of the mess otherwise. Here's that question. Wouldn't your thesis require that Christian-based societies would be less bloodthirsty than, I'm not sure what this hyphen is, anyway, based on atheist-based societies? How do you account for colonialism, slavery, blood murders, many, for instance, Stalinism? Well, I think the claim of your presupposition or question is false. I don't think that's happened, and I do think that that's a mixed picture of colonialism. There was great good that was done, and there were also evils that was done. And I think that the Europeans had a tough time making up their mind whether they were going to be evangelists or whether they were going to be conquerors.
That's a great question, and I think something that can be helpful here is the historic Christopher Dawson. When he talks about Christian culture, he says what makes a Christian culture is what it holds to be true, not the moral way it lives. Because it'd be pretty weird if Christians, or at least Catholics, were to claim that somehow Catholic culture makes you sinless. That would seem to be utterly contrary to their claims of the Catholic Church and why there's a sacrament that deals with sin. I think Dawson is on something that can be helpful for us, so that the kind of unity of Christendom, we can be careful, we can overplay that one. But there is a kind of common vision of reality, if you were, and of moral obligation, even though nobody else has quite made that level of moral obligation. Some seem to fail terrifically. And it might very be that they're a failure, they might just recognize, oh, there's a failure. And there's a particular kind of sin that comes with that kind of a culture. So I think I would suggest one wants to be careful equating morality and culture. Really, that's what I would say, especially with regard to the question of Christian culture. And it's part of what I think is helpful what Dr. Boyle is doing. He's trying to level an idea and then say, and those ideas then consequences of behavior. But first and foremost, it's about ideas.
Well, but I mean, isn't there a bit of a contradiction here? Because if the claim is that in fact ideas do influence, have this very strong causal bearing on behavior, then it would follow that Christian culture should in fact be less violent. And it seems that shouldn't be that difficult to demonstrate, with due apologies for the times when in fact it was violent. So, for example, the example of Stalinism was mentioned. Well, clearly you're dealing with precisely a culture that has decided very clearly against Christianity in that situation. So, but I would agree at the same time that we have to grapple with the weakness of will problem, namely that no matter how moral my beliefs are, my will is still going to fail. And I think Dawson was kind of articulating that, but I think we could kind of more.
Well, here's the question. Is God necessary for morality? And then it goes on. Couldn't a group that follows a philosophy of love and discipline avoid the pitfalls of Romanticism? And my short answer would be, although it's a big issue, is God necessary for morality? Is yes. There are attempts apart from God I have no confidence that they will succeed. I've had the privilege of reading C.S. Lewis with many of you, or with some of you in this room. And he starts his great work, Mere Christianity, with an argument that bears on this topic. And he talks about two people who are having a quarrel. So the very fact that these people are having a quarrel suggests a higher standard. And so, because otherwise, if they have nothing to quarrel about, they could just, Lewis says they could just fight like animals. So they have the moral sense. So Lewis starts with that. So in answering this question, I would say, yes, we have the moral sense. But Lewis then adds, a few pages later, we just don't have the ability to live up to it perfectly. And that's the problem. We need something called forgiveness. And that forgiveness is important for yourself, it's important for your romantic future. There's no way two people are going to live together for 45 or 50 or 60 years and not have something to apologize about. It's not going to happen. And so forgiveness is part of this, as is the notion that there's none righteous, not even one. This is a cause for humility. And humility is a softener. If I'm all arrogant about my sense of justice and those other guys that disagree with their injustice, I'm forgetting some things. I'm forgetting about my own imperfection. I'm forgetting about Christ's teaching. Take the beam out of your own eye before you try to take the speck out of your brother's eye. So I think humility, we need to pursue justice, but we need to do it in a chastened way.
So godless people can't be moral.
So let's see.
The question was whether godless people can or cannot be moral.
I think godless people can try. I think all of us can try. I think we all should try. We should do the best we can. I predict less than perfect results.
There's actually one here out of this stuff. I would say yes, of course they can, but I know lots of wonderful atheists who are moral, I expect, in ways we would agree. But I would also agree with Phil, we'll all fail, and that's irrespective of belief claim. But this picks up, I think, where we are, Phil. One of the more modern authors like C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien have done with regards to the incident of public atheism, Nihilism, Marxism, assuming the questions in regard to critique. And maybe I'll touch on that and you can see more. What is interesting, I think, that when Lewis wrote a bunch, essay-wise, especially about Tolkien and King, is a sense that perhaps the way to try and deal with this is by way of story and beauty. That if we can get story well done, truthfully done, that it might help us think better than simply demands and simply arguments. It's always sort of a good argument. As hard as our philosophers try to help us do that. But sometimes a good story, Lord of the Rings, might help us think more deeply about the nature of things. The sense that after you look quite a wall, we might actually try to get an internal calibration, try to get things more rightly thought out. Since the reading, Christian Law started something like with my graduate students, and don't want to spoil it for you, I will not spoil it for you. Other than to say, It's a great study in just the way life goes on. And you just live with the consequences of your life. And you have choices about how you're going to live with those consequences. And there are the things in us, the little hostilities, the ingratitude, the lack of forgiveness. So many good people around with us. That's not a bad thing to think about. And sometimes, instead of having Dr. Rolnick say it or you say it, to watch it unfold in the story can be powerful to decide and the truth of
I like the way in that story they never drink anything except some kind of beer.
Actually, they sometimes have wine.
Oh, yeah, special.
But it's because they bring from France. That's not good.
It's a great 14th century gin.
Nobody drinks Norwegian wine.
Yeah. So here's a question. It says, what would you say about the relationship of Christian hope and despair to the ideas of these four movements? How does hope address each movement? Well, it's more than hope. I think that Christianity gives alternatives to each of these four movements. And as Dr. Boyle was saying in his remarks, each of those four movements is a kind of a shadow movement that comes after the denial of Christian truth. So, for instance, in the first one of this elevation of the ego, the romantic elevation of the ego, well, Christianity does elevate the ego, but it doesn't do it all at once. It doesn't do it with ruinous excess of collateral damage to others. It does it with a sense of limits, and even natural limits and supernatural limits, and it does it in a way that is slower, but it's also eternal. That each of us really will be lifted up in what the Romantics were trying to do all at once, right now, for me, now, because I'm like the tiger. I think it's okay to be a tiger in some areas, but it's okay to be a lion, too. So, in that sense, and then in terms of atheism, well, atheism is a starting point. It's really as Dr. Boyle was saying, it's really a negation of Christianity, and it's almost unthinkable in the pagan world. They had their gods, they went with their gods, they celebrated their gods. Christianity pretty much wiped out all of its competitors where it went. And so the choice now is either, as one writer put it, David Bettenhart, choices between Christianity and nothing. For those of us who have been the inheritors of the Judeo-Christian tradition. And then if we jump to Marxism, Marxism has a vision. It wants to do something. It wants a kind of a brotherhood of all people, or a human fellowship of all people, but it doesn't want God as Father. So it removes the one crucial feature which actually would make a human family possible. And of course you can say, well, Christians didn't historically do that. Yeah, they were wrong, and every time they failed. And that's a bad thing. But Christians also learn over time. And it's best when they don't repeat the same mistakes. And I see sometimes that.
I might cast the hope thing. Okay, this way. My beloved Seneca, wonderful pagan that he is, brilliant pagan that he is, tells us that there are two passions we really have to get control over: hope and fear. We're going to get control of hope and fear, we're in really deep trouble. Those who study some Stoicism will recognize this. If we let those emotions, our hope and our fear, just get out of control, they rule us. We have to rule them. It's very smart, it's very wise, it's very difficult. Christianity plays a really dangerous game. Because Christianity says, no, actually, hope, there is a legitimate hope. If hope we can bow before. It's theological virtue, it's not passion, but the passions can be ordered to it. And it unleashes this thing in us and orders it to eternity and means to eternity. Especially when it says Christianity plays a dangerous game. What happens when you've unleashed all that, and then you say, no, but actually that end isn't there. Excuse me, at that point what we've got is an unleashed hope. And it's got to go somewhere. Yeah, I think that's what the Darren will find that is okay, so we've got this hope, this incredible thing, and that incredible thing isn't there. Going back to Seneca is really hard to yeah, let's go to limited hope. Not limited hope. We're going to direct it somewhere else. And we're going to try to build that great thing here and now. That gets to be especially messy. But I think there's an interesting consequence in the Christian thing that's at work here. If you don't get that Christian hope, you've unleashed something that you might not have to release.
So hope unleashed as something destructive. It seems to me that both in the Romantic movement and in Marxism, you can see interesting parallels to that. So certainly, Marxism domesticates hope in a very specific way, namely claims that the suffering of the present generations, no matter how miserable they are, in fact provides an opportunity for the future generations to, in fact, inherit something like the kingdom of sausage on earth. So it's sort of self-satisfied and some kind of fulfilled materialist existence here on earth is granted through what? Through the suffering of the present. So there is a strong sense of hope in the future in a world in which the transcendent has left the picture altogether. And the human person, as you pointed out also, has disappeared, or at least the value of the individual has disappeared because, of course, the individuals are no longer made in the image and likeness of God, but rather are simply disposable commodities of society. So let me just stop there. There's clearly some interesting parallels with what you said.
Paul, is there anything else you would like to say about the former Soviet?
I actually wanted to simply piggyback on your discussion with David Bentley Hart's position that it's a choice between Christ and nothing on the one hand. And then it seems to me your redemption of Seneca. So there's a bit of a tension there. Because if you can be a fulfilled and intellectually fulfilled Seneca, complete with wonderful virtues, maybe not the full Christian package, certainly not the full Christian package. It seems to me Seneca is not really driven to some sort of nihilistic realm. And it seems to me also Aristotle was not a nihilist. So at least in that particular case, it's sort of historically demonstrable that one could in fact be a non-Christian and a non-nihilist. But this is my beef with David Bentley Hart and not with you.
But what's interesting is sort of like Seneca, where Seneca's pretty confident that there is nothing after this life.
Right.
This is what you got. You make the best of it. Don't be ashamed of your passions. But everyone, you get it done something. He says, but it's not even hope. A true hope. And it's just what if there were something after this? There's an openness. He's not completely shutting it down. It's usually you got Aristotle or Plato or Seneca. There's kind of openness to a possibility. And the difference between Seneca and a Marx is Marx is closing the door to the open. Whereas Seneca doesn't think the door is there, but if it were, he'd be delighted to walk through it. And I think it's really hard once the door has been opened to go back out and close it to be Seneca.
Thank you. We still have many questions. Those of you who need to leave for classes, we completely understand that we will be continuing at least until 1:30. So carry on. You can also come down. Yes.
Well, let's get a question here. Many say true Marxism has never been tried. What do you say to that? In other words, is it possible to have a peaceful and tolerant Marxism, or why not? And I'm just delighted to see that question because it's right on the money. Every time it's tried, they say, well, we're going to get it right this time. Not like those other guys, the ones who messed up and, impoverished everybody, made everybody miserable, destroyed everything, and killed all those people. We're going to get it right this time. But they never do. They have a very, very bad, empirically, demonstrably bad historical record. There's no wins. And I think the problem is in the theory itself, because it starts with the absolute rejection of God. Now, if you started with a different principle, we'd have a different conversation. But when that's your first principle, that there is no God, and our job is to restore the divinity of the workers, which is supposed to be this divinity that we all of a sudden have, which I think is also a falsehood. There's so many initial falsehoods that everything that follows, I think, is going to be problematic.
Ideas have consequences.
Well, the difficulty, the staying power of Marxism also has to do with the fact that there is a theory of justice that's driving it. And this theory of justice has to do with the fact that there is a condition of oppression, and that condition needs to be lifted up. So it obviously is a secularized version of also Christian teaching on sin. The problem is you remove which one sin. And so the kind of configurations of Marxism that allow, certain homeopathic doses of Christianity into it become, obviously very attractive, and still very attractive to lots of academics and beyond.
Yeah. Now, I'd love to take some of the questions that I know some of you have, but I think, and to respect the ones who wrote them, we'll just go on with that. If theology is not a category of anthropology, what would you say it is? John, why don't you take that?
Well, one could say it's not about man, it's about God. The reason Feuerbach wants to do reduction is he wants to say there is no God to talk about, so we can't have any reasoned consideration of what God is. There's no thought of reasoned consideration of God. So all we've really got is reasoned consideration about man. I'm not saying about us, and part of that reason conversation. So how do we end up thinking about something as stupid as God? I mean, it's well, it's our aspirations. It's who we are. If we're actually thinking about God, it's just there's a reality there to be thought of. We've got theology.
Here's another.
Well, other than the fact that, of course, the power of Feuerbach's thesis cannot be denied. One of the reasons we created religious studies departments is so that we could revel on this premise. And the fundamental premise is religion is nothing but a phenomenon of culture, and what's culture is the product of humans. And therefore, what we're going to be studying actually is the epiphenomenon. What we'll be studying is human experience of God. We actually will not be looking at God. And of course, theology begins, and in some sense ends, with divine revelation. And it's really the profound rejection of divine revelation in the name of all sorts of other goods, like religious experience, and other things that really, that fundamentally is at the core of the reduction.
I love that, and I think theology lives or dies, as Paul just said, on revelation. If God is the only person in the universe who's deaf and dumb, we might as well not have God. So Christianity starts with the assumption that God has communicated and continues to communicate. Communicated in creation, communicated in Christ, and can communicate to each of us, even individually. And that's a basic assumption that what we're involved in is a partnership. So if we go back to John's point about incarnation being so central, well, it is, because what is the incarnation? It's that not that Christ was pure God. That was the first heresy. That was the Gnostic heresy. It's that he's truly God and truly man, both God and man. This is what was so creatively studied about the claims about the incarnation, the claims of Christian faith. And so, in this kind of a question about can we do morality apart from God, maybe, I don't know, I doubt it. But I think we are constructed by God. We are created by God. We are formed by God in the image of God. And I think that in some literal sense, not that we look like God, but in a literal sense, that the claim is real. And the claim is real, and that we are in a partnership. Our lives are meant to be a partnership. It's not just Boyle, it's all us, or Marx, it's all us. See, and that's the danger, I think, of religious studies, as you pointed out, is that we always like to think about ourselves that much. But I've gotten bored with thinking about myself that much. I like the partnership.
Yeah, but do I have to be explicitly religious, or do I have to have explicit religious beliefs in order to be moral? It seems to me it would not be a particularly kind or good God that would create the world in which atheists are simply immoral. And so it seems to me that if one accepts the idea that there are moral intuitions, it would then follow that one could still abide by those, or some sort of moral maxims that in fact hold across the board, that are sort of innate to human nature. If that is the case, okay, then it would follow that one doesn't actually have to hold a belief there is a God in order to be moral. One would still, but I would say that you can have a sort of a small package of moral trivia with that. But I think when it comes to socially significant questions, the belief in God really kicks in big time. Like, for example, one's views about marriage, one's views about human sexuality. On those questions, one actually has to have some sense of where one stands vis-a-vis the question of belief.
And here's a question: how do we overcome society's refusal of respecting limits? And then the question goes on to name some of the violations that I'm loath to mention simply because I think I'd be canceled. So how do we do that? And I think we have to have enough confidence in our own family structure, our own governmental structures. And how do you get that confidence? You can't manufacture it, and you can't say, well, let's all be confident tomorrow at 10 a.m. I don't think it'll work. I think the way to get confidence is through a sense of purpose, through a sense of being a son or daughter of God. And then we at least know, we have some sense of it. It's the church more as an enclave. The church as a group that can teach its people the kind of virtues that can value limits. Can our society do it? Live question, interesting question, not sure. I think the church has to do it. And the problem is that the church doesn't do anything perfectly, because the human part is never gone. But that seems to be the style that God prefers, is to work with us rather than just to impose it.
I wonder really about that about this. I don't want to quite the kangaroo issue. We can say world without limits, but there's always limits. I mean, you have to recognize there's limits to what I'm capable of just because of who I am. But even if I want a world without limits, I at least have to limit you if you want to limit my world without limits. But there's no way to function without limits. So we begin this idea of the limitless, but we just bump into the performative self-contradiction. We live that way. Mm-hmm. And I think sometimes it's good to sometimes pause and ask, is the way I'm thinking, does it correspond to the way things are? And if my limitlessness means I have to limit you, then it's not even full limitlessness.
No, that's the Uber edge.
That's part of the problem.
See, and
And so you might have an chain of move at that point, which solves the problem.
Yeah.
But then you talk about universal lovelessness, is just a certain level.
we need a reason beyond our own reason. And I think we have that in the Logos of Christian faith.
So the romantic aspiration, therefore, to the world without limits is a delusion, but it is a very powerful delusion, nevertheless. And so,
I like to be that one. I just think you want to have some.
well, exactly. That was precisely the point. And I think the way in which that's solved in German idealism or in Romanticism is to say that yes, it's an infinity, but it's actually potential infinity. In other words, it's an infinity that at any actual state, in fact, is finite. But there are ways in which there is still a possibility, and so for self-transcendence, which actually is not false. But what one makes subsequently out of it can in fact be dangerous and has been dangerous.
And here's another good question on a somewhat different topic. Is there a form of Christian romanticism? Can a Christian romantic hero exist? And the answer there is yes.
Yeah.
Yes, yes. It's called marriage. Men and women living together in marriage, being loyal to each other, raising kids together. Yes. It's what John Paul II called the domestic church. What an honor for a family to be called the church by the person at the head of the church in the Catholic tradition. Yeah, I think there is a kind of a quiet heroism. It's not the kind of lightning bolts, glamour and so forth, but I like quiet. I like normal. I like day to day.
You know, I would push back on, that's not your notion of romantic, as you spelled it out years ago. Because it's not the elevation of the ego.
Well, fair enough, but I'm saying the question was, is there a form of Christian romanticism? Mm-hmm. And it's not the elevation of the ego.
So therefore the answer is no.
All right, if you want to.
It's much easier than that.
There's a Jane Austen sense of romance that can be done within not the Greece.
No, I wouldn't agree with that. Not the way you find it.
You got to go back to the 14th century to get this.
Well, yeah, you can find romanticism as the elevation
of
ego, especially in reaction to the overplay of reason.
No.
Then,
with that premise, the answer is no. But I'm changing the premise and saying that if the self accepts the kind of limits that you're talking about, John, and lives within the limits that are given, that you accept, in fact, you make a sacred covenant about before God, a lot of witnesses. I'll keep my promises here. That is a form, that's the highest form of this romantic love. But it's a different sense of romantic. I'm equivocating on the term romantic. So here's the question. What part did skepticism play in the modern descent to darkness?
Huge. I mean, starting, I guess. But it's an interesting question again. If one says somehow that enlightenment was univocally reason's rebellion against religion, then one gets one destination. I would probably want to modify that thesis quite considerably. And I would want to say that in many ways it was also an exercise of reason's reinvention of its own religion, and a good example would be something like Kant, right? So Kant obviously has a religion of his own, it's a religion of reason, and for that reason, it becomes an exercise in reinventing of religion. And I think the romantic experiment is also an exercise in inventing a particular religion. You can try baptizing it with buckets of water, but what you get at the end is somebody like Goethe, who has a fuzzy notion of a God, or at least whose spouse has a fuzzy notion of a God, or Schleiermacher for that reason. So you can go in some interesting directions. But I think you can also go, I guess, if you want your most Catholic episode of both German Romanticism and at the same time idealism, it would be someone like Shelley, especially late Shelley.
Well, I hear we should probably close soon, but here's one question. In your opinions, are there any positives to or societal gains that resulted from Romanticism, Nihilism, Marxism? I've got one. Beethoven was third.
Allegretto was seventh.
Yes.
You're talking about the third concerto. Beethoven's third
I was
concerto.
talking about the symphony.
Oh, the symphony. Well, I'll go for the concerto. But I mean, it's the same.
We got the medieval revival.
To the extent to which Romanticism revives precisely.
Because he's trying to find something other than the confines of the industrial reality. I think there's a lot of, the human heart reacts, and there's a lot of good reactions. And frankly, some insights, right? The question of how you navigate that, and some pretty good navigating. Newton's efforts in animism, John Paul's
This last question, I think it is the last question. I think it's so good. It's about moral reversion, but in the interest of time, because it is one for you, I think we should stop. And please talk. If you wrote this question, talk to me.
Yeah, let's thank our speakers.